Alright guys, so today on the bench we have a TLR 22T. Going to do a little rewire on this, tidy up the main battery and main motor wires. The customer just needs a little bit of tidying up on the wiring, and these solder joints need to be redone. As you can see, 90% of the wire is not even in contact with the posts on the speed control. But we'll get that all taken care of, and we're going to go all black on the motor wiring for him. And we'll get this done, and have some other issues I've noticed with the truck that we'll address as well. But we'll get this as tidy as we can, and I will do some soldering tips as we go as well. I'll show you guys how to get this stuff to flow out nicely. So one of the first things we do is we cut all those crazy little cable ties, zip ties, some folks call them. Get all that stuff unwound, make sure none of the wire is damaged before we go any farther. Now we're going to start the unsolder process, and we'll start rewiring this car. So one of the complaints we get from a lot of customers is that they cannot desolder 10 and 12 gauge wire with their particular soldering iron. I'm going to show you a little trick. Some of you guys know this, some of you guys don't. Obviously you need to have a good soldering iron that gets very hot, 850, 900 degrees. So you put this little tip on there and it doesn't do anything. You're just heating up that little tiny area. However, if you add solder to it, you melt a bunch of solder, you get enough heat across that whole area that you start to desolder the entire wire. Eventually it gets nice and soft. Takes a little bit, and you pull that wire right off. So keep that in mind, guys. You can always add solder in those desolder situations. Now the next thing you have to do, you can see all the clumps and the globs and everything that are on all the posts. Those have to be cleaned up. All that solder has to be removed, and I clean all the posts with a brass brush, and we'll show you that before we go to resolder the wires back together. Something else here that's pretty important, guys. If you look on this very first motor tab, you can see the huge dollop of solder under the tab. That is supposed to be on top of the tab and not that much, but that is a potential short circuit right there. Hope you can see that. There's a huge dollop underneath of that motor wire tab, and that's a lot of cause for concern right there. So that's something else when you're wiring this stuff up. If you don't have a good enough soldering iron, and you have to spend so much time getting it hot, sometimes you end up putting solder where it doesn't belong. So that's something that we have to address here too, and get these tabs cleaned off and straightened up, and we'll get these done correctly. So unfortunately, guys, we had a little camera malfunction during the resolder process. But you can see we've rewired this truck entirely. This is a TLR 22T once again. Made a couple other changes, rearranged the electronics for the customer. Now we will be shortening those servo leads, the transponder and the speed control lead, next time he gets them in here to the shop. But I'm going to go ahead and reset up the solder station, and we'll give you a couple of tips and show you a couple little things there that hopefully will help you guys. So a couple things that you definitely want to have to do a good quality solder job is, of course, depending on what you're doing, but you definitely want a good solder jig, or a couple of them. I recommend 60-40 rosin core on the solder. 1 millimeter diameter pretty much does everything in our hobby. And here is a very high-end, very good quality Xtronic soldering station. And this thing here gets very serious, as you can see, 896 degrees, which is very important. That is very, very important. Now we do have some other solder here, also 60-40, just bigger diameter. But these are some tools you're going to need. The brass brush, pretty important. Your CNC solder jigs, some good, decent, clean solder. Nothing that's dirty. If it's dirty and has oil and all kinds of crap on it, you need to clean it with acetone or get a fresh roll. And a really good soldering iron. Heiko is something that we used, it's a brand that we used for many, many, many years. In fact, over on my messy bench, and it is messy, I still have my original Heiko 936. Oh, I guess that thing is probably 25 years old, and it still kicks. It's just in the corner in the mess, so I bring out the little portable unit. It's a little bit easier to use. So we'll get after it here in just a second, and hopefully show you a couple tricks that you can utilize. Making your solder jobs a little easier. All right, so as you can see, we've got a 4mm bullet connector. This is a butt style connector. It's sort of like something that comes on like a Castle Creation system where you can unplug the motor from the speed control. And you can see it is brand new. We make it a good point to make sure everything that we work with is clean and ready to go. So one of the first things that I do to make this job a little bit easier is we'll go ahead and get our tip in there. We'll start getting her warmed up. And it's actually a little cool today for a Florida day, so it takes a little bit longer than it might on other days, especially during the summer. And we'll just start to get some solder to flow in here. You can probably see it sort of glue itself to the back wall of that fitting there. Let's see how that bullet is right there. It just sort of glues itself to the back very nicely. So we'll put that aside. We'll get our wire here that we're going to use. We'll get our wire cutters, and we'll strip back a little section of this wire, reveal some nice fresh wiring. Hopefully you can see that. We have our second solder jig sitting here that we're going to use just to make things easy. Now, one thing you want to remember on this one, try to keep as much of this bullet out of the block as possible, because this block acts like a heat sink and it will draw the heat away quickly from the item that you're soldering on. So it's always something you want to think about, especially if conditions are a little colder, if maybe your soldering gun isn't quite up to the task. Try to keep your work out of that block as much as possible. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and pre-tin our wire here as well. And what I do is I like to just kind of get up to the end of it, sort of like that. Let it warm up a little bit and start flowing some wire into those strands. And you can see it flow pretty nicely. Even if you make a little glob, doesn't matter. You want it to stay on there for a little bit and really get in those strands of that wire. So now we've placed both of our pieces basically together, which will make it a little bit easier. And obviously not every soldering job is going to be like this. But I like to lay as much of this tip, I'm cleaning it again on some brass type steel wool. I like to lay it across, get as much of it on there as I can. And like we talked about with desoldering, sometimes in order to heat up the whole area, you've got to add a little solder to the location, just to get things sort of flowing. And you saw it right there. Hopefully you see it flow out and the whole thing sort of come together. You can see it flowing the solder nicely. And don't be afraid to leave it on there for a little bit. Make sure that it flows through all the strands and into all the nooks and crannies of your part that you're trying to solder. What you think might be a good solder job that's a huge pile, a huge mess of stuff, generally is the worst solder joint you're ever going to have. Something that's nice and clean and looks very liquid, looks like it flowed in there like ice cream melting, is going to be your best joint with the least amount of resistance. So your completed joint really looks very nice. It's flowed out all over. There's no air pockets. There's no areas that the solder is missing, and you can see that it has flown, that it has flowed onto both the bullet and thoroughly through the strands of wire. So that is an absolutely excellent joint, and we'll finish that up with a little bit of shrink sleeve. So one of the tools I'll use at the racetrack or somewhere away from the shop bench to use shrink sleeve or something of that nature, loosen up a tight bolt that's in metal to metal. Use a little mag torch. It's a little butane mag torch like this. Just pretty easy to use, very convenient. Of course, it gets very, very hot, so you have to be very careful. Generally, in the shop here, I use heat guns to use to tighten up shrink sleeve and things of that nature. So on a bullet like this, that's that long, you want to make sure that however you're wiring this to your ESC, to your motor, to battery connector, whatever it may be, that you don't leave this much exposed, because that obviously is a potential for a short. So then the question becomes, where do you put your shrink sleeve? In a application like this, you would go all the way to the end, because there's a male bullet that is going to go on the end of that. So you want to cover that entire bullet all the way to the edge. And again, I just use my little torch, wave it around, I just don't care, and do the shrink sleeve like that. So now you're in pretty good shape. As you can see, it's pretty much tight all the way around. I will still get the back side of it just a little bit, in case I didn't see the heat correctly. But that is a completed 4mm bullet connector that we'll never have a problem with. There'll be no amp loss. If there is, it's very, very minuscule compared to some of the solder joints you see out there. Some of them are really, really bad, I'm not gonna lie. But that's the way you correctly flow out a joint when you're doing solder work like that. And this is something you'll never have to worry about. It's secure, it's accurately done, it's done with enough heat, it's done with the right type of solder. Now you've shrink sleeved it, so it's sealed. This will last longer than your RC car in most cases.